The Washington Post headlines blasted yesterday that 5 former secretaries of defense are alarmed at the firing of Trump's generals. Former defense chiefs denounced Trump's reckless Pentagon firings, they say. The 5 former leaders urged Congress to hold the president accountable for what they called his unjustified removal of the Joint Chiefs chairman and other top military officers. Now, what in the world has the Washington Post so alarmed, and what's going on with this? You may recall we did a show last week where we talked about several of the generals had been fired. Hegseth fired 5 generals. President Trump released the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, A.Q. Brown, and everybody was in an uproar at that time too, because it was unusual. Usually the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff continues to serve his full term, and it doesn't matter if it coincides or crosses over presidential administrations. They continue to go on forward with that without changing anybody out. That's been kind of the tradition and the history up to this point. So now Trump is obviously changing that. This has a lot of people really concerned because it breaks tradition. And it has all these defense secretaries concerned because they list a number of problems that they claim with it. But I think that when you get right down to it, there's a number of things that they say which have some caveats at the very best. But what this really looks to me more like is it's the establishment figures, the guys who are always at the top of this, who are running the so-called foreign policy elite or the national security elite. They don't like anybody messing with their stuff. I've mentioned this before, that when Hegseth came in and said that Trump gave him the mission to reform and reorganize and rebuild the Pentagon, and to do it in a different way than it's ever been done before, that he was going to run up against some headwinds. And it looks like that they have started removing some of those headwinds. And I said specifically that he was going to have a lot of resistance from the Pentagon, and he's going to need to get some people out of there. And that's obviously what's happened here, because this is the first one. Hopefully it's not the last. Evidence is going to suggest that it's not the last of them. But the headwinds I spoke about is the very result of this article, because it is signed by all of the former secretaries of defense, guys who were really elevated because of the establishment. They played their role right. The last one is Secretary Austin was one of the signers, was one of the worst, because he came from defense industry, the military industrial complex. He came out of that. I haven't seen where he's landed since then, but it would not surprise me in the least. In fact, I would be surprised if he doesn't go back there again. That's just kind of how it works with all of these guys. They make a lot of money, most of them, before they come in, and they make a lot of money in the military industrial complex after they go out. So it's just kind of this revolving door. You may have heard that phrase before, and these guys are in that, and they don't want anybody messing with that. And we had, when we talked about this last week, we had Doug McGregor on to give his view on this. He fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown, and then right after that, Hegseth himself let 5 different generals go. What do you think of it?
I think that anybody that you boot out at this point is a good decision. We're at the end of a long period of what I would call core rot in the Department of Defense. We've got large numbers of people at the top who have no business being there. They should never have been promoted to the ranks that they hold. The steady deterioration from excellence to mediocrity that I've been watching over the last 30 years is just astounding. And we have clearly bottomed out. So whatever Secretary Hegseth wants to change, I'm 100% behind it. The one criticism I would level is this. We don't want to rebuild anything, Dan. We want to build a new force. This is a strategic inflection point in the history of the United States. This is a time where we need to bring the forces back, and we need to retread, reorganize. That means organize for a different war in the future and pay attention to our security here at home, principally the border with Mexico, but not just that, the borders, the coastal waters. Get focused on what really counts, and that's defense of our homeland. That has been ignored for far too long.
And if that's what it takes to get those things done and to get those changes made, then I think more of that is going to be necessary. And in fact, I've mentioned before that there is precedence in the United States for this. This is not the first time this has happened. In fact, so far, the scale is far less than it's been done in the past. Prior to World War II, the chairman of the chief of staff of the U.S. Army said, "Hey, we have a lot of deadwood in here." And actually, the president of the United States authorized him. FDR said, "Hey, you know what? Get rid of this dead wood. If we're going to be fighting a war here in the future, we need to make sure we've got guys who are on board with what we're doing here. We're not going to refight World War I and all the things that happened with that. We need people who are going to be focused here." And virtually all of the senior colonels and generals that they eventually let go, and the number exceeded 500. You heard that right. 500 were let go. Because they were not almost, all of them were steeped in and had grown up in the World War I mindset, which is, set piece battle, the trench warfare, not a lot of maneuver, no technology, or at least not any of the technologies it was applying at the day. And they needed somebody who's going to come in with a more agile mind, who was open to newer ideas. And that's exactly what they did. That's the same kind of thing that we need to do now. If the vision that Doug laid out there about where the military should reform and reorganize, and Hegseth has said that he's going to do that, he just hadn't said how yet. But however he's going to do it, whatever objective he wants to achieve, he's going to have people who have agile minds, who are not locked in the past, and are definitely not part of the so-called deep state or the establishment, whatever phrase you want to use. Guys who were in the old set of the mind, like the 5 signatories of that letter. They don't want anything to change. They just want to do it different than they have. They just want to get more money. That's what they've all said. All these guys who signed this, they were always about get more money, make the Pentagon bigger, and then they used a lot of buzzwords like lethality and future combat systems and all kinds of other buzzwords that never translated to anything on the battlefield, or even translated anything in terms of on the ground, how the military was formed. In fact, they went backwards. They actually went back from what they called a brigade-centric force in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, back to where they were before Desert Storm, back to where they were in World War II, a corps, a division, a brigade, a battalion, company, and then down to the platoons and then into the fighters. That's the way we fought before. So they're just wanting to do the same thing, and they want to put a few bells and whistles on, and they say, here's some drones, and here's some more electronic warfare technology, et cetera. So they just want to kind of make the old one better a little bit. Well, the war in between Russia and Ukraine has decisively shown that warfare has profoundly shifted. And we need people who are agile of the mind, who are paying attention to what's going on and are ready to do things significantly different. Because I'm telling you, if we go to war with the force that we have right now, the one that's only marginally different than the one that I fought with in Desert Storm in 1991, we will have our butts handed to us. We will lose. We will lose if we fought against the Russians right now. God forbid that should happen. I don't want it to, but we're not prepared for it. We're not prepared psychologically. We're not prepared physically. Definitely not prepared organizationally. A lot of things have to change. The way we fight, the way we're organized, the kinds of equipment that we have, the way just blocking and tackling, so to speak, the fundamentals, those have changed. And you just can't get the same guys who have made their entire careers at doing things the same way. You're not going to change the force if that's the people that you put in charge here. So I think Secretary of State Hegseth and the president are right in what they're doing. But as I've said before, it really does matter how it's going to be done. Now, one of the big charges in this letter is that this was politicizing the military, and the authors found this to be very alarming, which is a little odd because especially the previous administration and Secretary Austin were quite a bit into the whole politicization of the Pentagon, and they hired all kinds of senior people at these levels that had all these different categories, and it did not appear to me to be based purely on merit. It seemed to be placed on categories. We wanted to make sure we have at least all these different categories, whether it's this sex or that sex, or some of the LGBTQ stuff, or this color or that color, or this background or that background. It seemed like those were scattered all throughout the force at some of the higher levels, which gave the impression that it was not merit that got all these people to these levels, or at least not merit alone. It's not to suggest that all the people who were in those positions didn't have some capacity, but it sure brought into question what the primary objective and morals were, values were. And of course, that was very much in line with the politics of the previous administration and the previous Secretary of Defense. So that's kind of in the eye of the beholder in terms of what's politics and what's not. But one of the things that the Trump administration seems to be focused on is accountability for actually doing the job, and whether you have merit for your position, whether you should even keep your position. And here was at the cabinet meeting here a couple of days ago, that subject actually came up, and this is what happened between Trump and his Secretary of Defense.
Mr. President, you were just talking about Afghanistan and the botched withdrawal. Have all the generals or command staff that were involved with the withdrawal been fired or relieved of duty?
Well, that's a great idea. I'm not going to tell this man what to do, but I will say that if I had his place, I'd fire every single one of them, Pete. That's a very good question.
Well, it's a question we've thought a lot about. We're doing a complete review of every single aspect of what happened with the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan, and plan to have full accountability. It's one of the first things we announced at the Defense Department for that reason, sir. Certainly, General Raising Kane, who's on his way in, was not a part of that. Instead, was a part of leading the effort against ISIS by untying the hands of warfighters and finishing the job properly, and then bringing our troops home. So we're taking a very different view, obviously, than the previous administration, and there will be full accountability.
Okay, I'm all for that. If that's the standard by which they're going to make these decisions, then that is a good thing, and that will help the force. However unpopular it may be, however much the establishment won't like it, I'm unconcerned about that completely. And in fact, this issue of accountability, and especially on the Afghan situation, is something I've been advocating for quite a long time. Here's a short clip of something that I said on the previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and his absence of accountability for the Afghan withdrawal. This is back in 2021.
But it's even worse than that, because on July 21st, so literally just 2 weeks before the collapse began, the final collapse, Milley said, hey, the Afghan government and military has the full capacity to continue to defend their country. And then it was about 10, 12 days later, then he makes the infamous statement that no one could have foreseen this coming. And so many people saw this coming. Actually, many people saw this coming. And for him to continually say that he didn't see this, and to make statements like he has, and then try to blame the State Department, as he did in other testimony, smacks to me of someone who is not accepting any responsibility for his actions and wants others to be held accountable.
And yeah, he wanted others to be held accountable. No one in the senior leadership was ever held accountable. The Biden White House actually did an after-action review of the Afghanistan withdrawal, and later concluded that there were some mistakes made, but that no one, and I mean no one in the State Department, no one in the Department of Defense, no one in uniform was ever held accountable for the mistakes that were made. And that includes one of the lesser known but horrifically egregious mistakes is after the 13 Marines had been killed and hundreds of Afghan civilians killed in that terrorist blast outside the Kabul airport. You may infamously remember that. There was another strike that happened in Kabul, where the whoever the general in charge, and we don't know who it was to this day, got some intelligence that there was another suicide bomber, a car bomber, that might be heading to try and do another terrorist attack. Well, what they had a drone, a surveillance drone, that was following this alleged vehicle that parked into a garage somewhere. And after some period of time, they said, you know what, we can't risk it, just fire and kill the person. Well, it turned out that not only was it not a suicide bomber, not only was the car not rigged for explosives, it was actually somebody who worked for the United States. It was a guy who had been very faithful to the United States, and he and many of his family members were killed in the blast. 10 people, mostly children, were killed in the blast. And that was an egregious failure, because it was self-evident, and especially when the information came out, it validated that missile never needed to have been fired. unless the vehicle is moving towards American troops, and then you have a go no go decision that if you don't take the shot, Americans could be killed because it just had happened, and there was some validity to the concern, no question about it. But then to kill all of these people when they were not, even the alleged vehicle was posing no threat to anyone in the United States, then that was an egregious, horrible decision that was entirely avoidable. And 10 people are dead. Children were killed. No one was held to account. How can that be? How can we be so callous that even when someone kills innocent kids, somebody who was on our side, just because of carelessness, was never held to account? And that's just one of the many things. And of course, with the soldiers themselves who were killed, and the way this thing was conducted, a lot of that blame needs to go on some of the senior administration folks who were responsible for setting the conditions that led to that awful day. But the fact is that no one was ever held to account, and that has to change, because that sets up this attitude within the senior ranks that you can do whatever you want. You can be careless, you can be callous, you can take unnecessary risks, and if it goes bad, doesn't matter. I'm not going to be held accountable anyway, and I'm going to get my retirement, and everything's going to be fine. That is not a healthy thing. It is very good and necessary to say, if you do not perform at the highest levels, you're going to be held accountable, and that you're not going to be allowed to go on. And people who have skills and merit below, we need to elevate some of these people. So I really hope that Hegseth does that, and continues to base these decisions on something that is for the improvement of the armed force. And one of the other things, it's interesting that this letter that was actually written by the generals, the secretaries of defense, Gary, if you can throw that up there, they said, listen, President Trump's actions undermine our all-volunteer force and weaken our national security. Talented Americans may be far less likely to choose a life of military service if they believe they will be held to a political standard. Those currently serving may grow cautious of speaking the truth to power, or they could erode good order and discipline by taking political actions in uniform. And the public's traditionally high trust in the armed forces could begin to wither. Secretary Austin, you can see there's the signatures there, one of whom is Secretary Austin, that just left office. And I can tell you that the confidence in the military significantly eroded under him, and James Mattis, even before that, the one that was in Trump's first term. The senior military took a big hit in public confidence, in part because no one was ever held to account for anything. Lots of people were hired for positions that they didn't appear to have the qualifications for, the merits for. It appears that they were put in for other political purposes. And you talk about recruiting. I mean, we have been in a recruiting crisis under the Austin leadership. And by the way, it's ironic that you say that could further erode it, when, according to a report that came out on the 5th of this month, the recruiting for the month of December was a 15-year high for the U.S. Army. So it appears that the people are saying, hey, we finally got somebody in there who may hold people accountable, who's going to bring the warrior ethos back to the Department of Defense and all the focus and the things that we have. So at least so far, the exact opposite is happening to what these guys are warning about, which really says more about the signatories and their performance than it does about what may be going on here. Now, I will tell you, I was a little bit concerned about the three of the officers, the judge advocates general, because those are the people who are in place that are supposed to be the watchdog of their respective branches. And they're supposed to be making sure that that people don't break the law, that people are held accountable for performance of their duties. And if anybody does anything wrong, or if they take action against somebody, et cetera, those are like the judge advocate generals, the law, basically, to keep them in. And the fact that three of those people were removed is somewhat concerning. And unfortunately, we don't know the reasons why. Did they have a history of being pro whatever category that you want to pick? Did they turn a blind eye to justice in the past? If that's the case, it would be helpful if the administration or if Secretary Hegseth would inform people about that. But so far, we don't really understand why. In fact, they haven't said that about anybody. We don't really know why any of these people were let go. Even when A.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was let go, Trump said a lot of nice things about him and said he was being let go, but he didn't say why. Then so far, no one's even told us the reasons why. In this letter, the signatories also say, hey, we need to have hearings. The House and the Senate needs to demand justification for each firing and why they did it. Well, no, they don't. There's no constitutional obligation for that at all. They don't have to give answers to that. You guys never gave answers to that. When you let people go, when you hired people or fired people, you didn't explain yourselves, to any certain standard. You certainly didn't do it under requirement at a House or Senate hearing committee. So that's not going to happen. That's not obligated. There's no requirement that happen, but it is helpful. And I think it is useful if you explain some of these things. When, like I said, when the culling happened before World War II, rather, a lot of these were explained, and it got a lot of people unhappy. There was lots of anger about it because, again, it was going after what was the institutional powers at that time, and they didn't like it. And a lot of these people had political connections, and it caused a lot of firestorm when it first happened. But they continued on, and it turned out that the Chief of Staff of the Army who was getting it done, George Marshall, who would later be Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, I think the only one who's ever held both posts, he had really good criteria, and he did his best to make sure it was absolutely based on merit. If Secretary Hegseth follows that standard and makes sure that anybody else who's let go, there's a very good practical military reason for their being released. And those he elevate up are genuinely merit-based, and not just because they're politically loyal to the president. They have to be genuinely good at what they're doing. If that happens, then this could end up being very good. And if Secretary Hegseth said that a second ago about that we showed you about, that it has to be something that shows that there's going to be accountability for the Afghan situation. Hopefully that'll apply to other things. And I really do hope that they just for good confidence building measures in their actions, I think that they should say, hey, here's the reason why we let these people go. Here's the reason why we elevated these people. That can give confidence in this process. And then it's going to all come down to performance. Then we're going to see what happens. If with these people gone and with these new people coming in, whoever those are going to be, how do they perform? Do they do their jobs? Does the Department of Defense increase? Is its capacity improved? Or is it just going to be business as usual? I mean, those are open questions. We don't know, and only time is going to tell. I think that the administration and the Secretary of Defense should be given the benefit of the doubt, because they're breaking with tradition. They're breaking with past, and the past and the tradition have not served us well, and it needs to be changed. Let's just hope that they have a good process going forward that will do that. That's all we got for you today on this topic. Be sure and tune back in here in a little while, because as you see, this just shortly for President Zelensky has finally come to the White House and is meeting President Trump, getting ready to move into some meetings, which I think are happening right now. We're going to have John Mearsheimer on to help us unpack a lot of whatever's coming out of there. Some other things with Keir Starmer yesterday. Are there going to be security guarantees for Ukraine? Should there be, or even can there be? John Mearsheimer will be on this afternoon. You're not going to want to miss that. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.